Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. My name is Kelly, and I will be monitoring today. We have a lot of people joining us, and we will be using the chat box. I'll monitor that, so enter your comments and questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a discussion period. So if you haven't turned on your chat box, go ahead, hover at the bottom. You'll be able to open that up. And I do ask that everyone keeps their video turned off, please. Okay, thank you. And introducing Joe Stoner.
Well, welcome everyone. This is Challenging Unwritten Rules Using Practical Wisdom. I am Joe Stoner, the manager of the Newark Library. Newark, California, not New Jersey or New York or the dozen other Newarks. We're about 20 miles north of San Jose. And the focus of my talk is the book Practical Wisdom. Let me see, how do I move the slides? Okay, here we go. It's the book Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing by Barry Schwartz and Kenneth Sharp. Barry Schwartz also has a TED Talk on this topic and is also the author of the book, The Paradox of Choice. So, in a little bit, I want to go into more detail about the book, but for now, this is my synopsis. Basically, the book argues that making good decisions is a skill we can all get better at. However, in US society, and maybe in other places too, there is a trend to standardize decision-making and rely less on individual judgment in many fields. And the problem is, life is complex, and overly relying on rules and policy can actually lead us all to make less fair decisions. So it's not that we should blatantly disregard rules, but we do need to consider extenuating circumstances. So that's the gist of what this talk is all about. I do want to emphasize, I don't believe that I have perfected practical wisdom. I'm on the same journey with all of you. But to shift gears, I kind of agonized about how many slides I should share. And in the end, I decided that I really wanted to focus on some stories I have, and that, you know, putting up slides would just distract from that. So to start off, some years ago in another library system I worked in, I got involved in a situation at the reference desk. I overheard a colleague about to issue a year-long trespass to a woman who was probably in her 20s. This seemed kind of extreme to me, so I decided to intervene. And what I learned was that the woman's library account was blocked because she had a billed item. And so she wasn't able to use a public computer to print. After she was initially told why she couldn't use the computer, on her own, in her desperation, the woman found a man who was willing to let her use his library card to log onto the computer. And honestly, that probably would have been the end of it, except neither one of them knew how to use the library print system. Imagine that. So the woman came back to ask for help. And that's when my colleague decided this woman had, you know, was flouting the directions she had been given and deserved to be trespassed. To give this a little bit of context, my library did have a rule that all residents had to use their library card to access a computer. I honestly can't remember if this was a written rule or if it was just implied. We actually would check IDs to verify who was a resident to decide if they could use a visitor computer pass. And I think, like in a lot of situations, the thinking behind this, had some justification to it. It was looking at computer use as a privilege, like checking out library materials, and that people should be responsible and have an account in good standing to use the public computers. That said, in this situation, I didn't think it was fair for someone to get trespassed over a print job. So I offered to walk with the woman to the computer lab to see if I could help her print. And after getting her form printed, I chatted with her a bit and learned that she was a single mom applying for welfare. And she was actually so desperate that she had started selling her clothes to make a little extra money. So I don't want to analyze this in too much detail right now, but just want to add that later when I debriefed with the library manager, I was told you can't make decisions based on emotion. That was the response I got. So I'm going to let you sit with that for a little bit while I tell you a little bit more about the book. And let me see if I can share this again. So the gist of the book is that really there's no policy or rule that can ever address the nuance of every situation. And as I said at the beginning, like as a society, we become overly reliant on rules to get people to do the right thing. There's a problem with this that can kind of backfire, where relying on rules and policy and with that incentives like pay incentives or awards can actually backfire by reducing people's motivation to do the right thing. I think the wording that the book uses is it will demoralize people or demotivate them. I look at this as the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So by trying to dictate for library staff or in other situations, everyone to do the right thing, we're essentially telling our staff that we don't trust you to make good decisions. There's a quote in the book that I really love. It's from the US Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo, who was on the Supreme Court in the early 20th century. And he said, the ideal legal system, quote, would be a code at once so flexible and so minute as to supply in advance for every conceivable situation the just and fitting rule. But of course, life is too complex to bring the attainment of this ideal. I think if we stop and think about that, that's really crazy to think that we can rely on a rule to tell us what to do in every situation. So there's an analogy in the book, and I found another photo just to illustrate it. And it's, this is a corner of the Parthenon, but it's looking at how the Greeks were able to measure the circumference of these columns so carefully. I mean, and basically what it takes is a flexible yardstick or a flexible rule. And I really like that analogy. It's not that you don't need the rule at all, but being able to interpret it, being able to adapt it to the situation is really what makes it useful in building a column. And the book focuses on a lot of different examples, like issues with judges and mandatory minimum sentences, restrictions on doctors working in HMOs, teachers with standardized curriculum and standardized testing. I enjoyed all of these examples just because it reminds me, we're not alone in libraries in facing these kinds of scenarios. This is really across our society. One of my favorite stories in the book is about a study about hospital janitors. There were researchers studying how janitors would approach their work. And if you look at the starting place of their job description, it's pretty obvious, I think, to all of us. Janitors clean, that's what they do. But these janitors who are interviewed really looked at their work differently. They saw their job in terms of the overall well-being of patients and family members and staff. They saw their work at its core as an opportunity to comfort and encourage people. There was one story of a janitor who had been told by their supervisor to clean the waiting room, but they saw a family sleeping there who had been there all week, waiting on a family member. And so the janitor essentially disregarded their supervisor's directions, at least temporarily, to allow this family to go on sleeping. And there was another janitor who cleaned the room of a man who was in a coma. And the man's father came back and was irate that the janitor hadn't cleaned it because the father had been out. And rather than argue with the father, the janitor just decided to clean it again, just to provide that kind of reassurance to the father. So I like to think that if this is how hospital janitors approach their work, how much more the rest of us, how much more library staff. So I've got another story. I'm sure many of you in your libraries may have a policy to charge a $1 or $2 fee for a replacement library card. But I wonder, have you ever asked yourself why that amount? Last time I checked, these cards only cost about 25 cents to custom print. So essentially we are penalizing people for this. So a library manager that I worked for once had taken this card replacement policy and interpreted it as every time a library visitor shows up without their card, they must buy a new card, even if they have another one at home. And one woman told me she had already purchased 7 or 8 replacement cards that she kept forgetting at home. So I think this is how many unwritten rules start. They're often an extension or maybe an overinterpretation of an actual written rule. And I want to ask you to think about some of the assumptions that are being made here about how people use the library. What if many people aren't planning their day around visiting the library? Maybe some people decide spontaneously to stop by the library. Some people, plan every week on a particular day. This is their library day, but I think most people visiting our libraries are more occasional visitors. We don't always realize this, but that same library system where I was working had done a survey and found this data that maybe a third of library members visit once a month or more often, but the majority is more rare than that, maybe a couple times a year. So anyway, with this interpretation that the library manager had come up with, I felt like the dead giveaway, this was not really fair to the community, was the circulation staff had developed a workaround. Rather than contradict the manager directly, they would ask people if there was anyone at home they could call to read their library card number over the phone. When I first heard this seemed absurd to me, but I didn't want to rock the boat until I had some experiences that were just so over the top. I did eventually talk to the manager about it. One of these, there was a man who came to the reference desk and said that he knew exactly where his library card was because he always kept it in the console of his car. But he'd been in a car accident, and so his car was at the auto body shop. and he wondered if I could look up his account some other way. So I thought this was a pretty plausible explanation. And when I helped him, he said, I appreciate someone with common sense. I'm sure I'm not always that good with common sense, but hey, I'll take it when I can. But the one situation that really killed me was a woman that was at the circulation desk. And when I was playing this game and asking her if there was anyone at home that she could call, her answer just crushed me. And that's when I decided I needed to talk to the manager. She told me, no, because my husband is in Afghanistan. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Am I gonna make this woman whose husband is in a war zone jump through some ridiculous hoop? So I talked to the manager, and unfortunately, the manager didn't really see, how this was being an unnecessary obstacle for people. And they responded in the end that they just thought that people need to be responsible. So I've got another example, and then I'll have some concluding comments and think we'll have time for questions. In the same library system, there had been a rule that had developed over time. And again, I think maybe the motives of the staff in the beginning made some sense. It was the 15-minute rule that we would help people with research questions up to 15 minutes, but then they needed to carry on their own. And I think, I've heard in many libraries I've worked in conversations around people monopolizing our time. But I think the way I look at it now is in our modern society, we all have areas where we are still a novice and where 15 minutes is not enough to teach us some skill or answer some question that we have. So we really do need to be a little more flexible than that. So there was this 89-year-old man who came into the library because he wanted to renew his post office box in another state. And you might wonder, why did he come to the library? Well, the post office sent him. Like, what? Apparently, you can only do this online. And as you might imagine, to do this online, you have to have an email address. And I bet you can see where this is going. Of course, he had never used a computer a day in his life. And so I spent the next 20 minutes or so helping him, creating an email address I knew he would never use again. I entered his credit card info on the post office website, another unwritten no-no, because we don't want to know or access people's personal information. And in the midst of this, I saw that he had on an Army veteran cap. And so I asked him about it. And it turned out he was a World War II vet and had retired after 20 years in the Army. So through all of this, I decided I was going to violate these unwritten rules because I just knew there was no other way he was going to get this done. And in a way, I really feel now like the fact that he was a World War II vet shouldn't have mattered, that anyone, in a similar situation, anyone who doesn't know how to use a computer, that I should be able to help them do the same thing. So for a few concluding comments, I don't think there's an easy answer to all of this. And I think the book itself really looks at this as an art form. That's something we get better at by sharing experiences with each other and practicing. I like to think that libraries, maybe especially public libraries today, are the help desk for our communities, and no request should be off limits unless it's illegal or unethical. There was that incident I had long ago where there was a man turned out was trying to get us to help him forge a license plate for his cargo trailer. So maybe that crosses the line. But other than that, we really need to look, through our library policies and rules, written or unwritten, and see if there are ways that we're needlessly making things difficult for people. I think, like in the my first story, the printing story, one thing I like to stop and think about is there some greater value to society as well? So, maybe we really do want that book back that, is billed on this person's account, but as a society, I think it's a greater need to keep this mother and her child from ending up homeless. And so, we should make some accommodations there. There's one more suggestion I have, something that I've developed with my staff in my current library, and it's a mental checklist to go through in making decisions, and we really decided it needs to be simple enough that we can just remember it off the top of our heads. So there's 2 questions, and number 1 is, what are the risks? I'm especially thinking of safety and legal kinds of risks. And then number 2, who does the situation impact? And in this, you're looking at that not all rules have equal weight in society and in our libraries. And I think we have to be able to interpret them to really provide the best service that we can to people. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And Kelly, do we have some questions?
Well, I've been monitoring the chat, and all of this really resonates with people. I find we have someone who, Emma, who's commented, I spent an hour helping a patron reset email and Amazon passwords the other week. And while we don't always have the time to give that much attention, it was dead as a doornail. So why turn a patron away at that moment? Sometimes we just need to take individual circumstances into account. And that's what you've been saying. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I like that. I'll just say that I think this whole perspective is that there's not one hard and fast rule about what to do in many situations. And that if you had been really busy that day, yeah, you probably would not have been able to do that. But I really like what you said, that what else were you going to do? You weren't busy that day, so why not help somebody for an hour?
We also have someone, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have your video on, if you hover down at the bottom of the screen and on the left side, if you just click on video, then make sure there's a red diagonal there to indicate that it's off. Thank you. And so we've had a lot of comments about people who have gone, libraries that have gone to no fines. And I've read articles too that where they've tried it, it's been very successful. We have Jenny who commented, my granddaughter's preschool room has a note painted on the wall that reads, fair is not everyone gets what they want. It means everyone gets what they need, meaning we are not equally in need. That's a good point.
That's great. I love that.
Well, and we have just on the other side, which is absolutely true, helping patrons with computer issues is potentially a huge time sink. That is, yeah.
It is potentially, but I think the challenge then to all of us, I think, is to find ways that we can still meet that need. Maybe it's not at that moment, but maybe we can, set up a class or computer lab hours, or, connect somebody to a volunteer that can help them more. My concern here is that we don't have hard and fast rules about we will or will not help people with certain things in the library.
Yeah, and we have someone else who's commenting, I used to help a visually impaired patient with his emails. We had the greatest conversations and he was so grateful for the help.
Love that.
I'm not sure if it's patient or patron, but yeah, I just, you know, what you've been saying is just treat people as, you know, people with their stories and when they're in need.
Thank you, Kelly.
So Christina has to say, this is dovetailing with a session I listened to at virtual PLA. A lot of these rules and policies are based in middle-class expectations, and libraries have middle-class biases. We need to be rethinking those as much as possible.
Couldn't agree more. And I think one phrase that kept coming to mind, I don't think I mentioned earlier, is just that saying that if you teach, if you give someone a fish, they eat for today. If you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime. And I think sometimes in the library world, we overuse that we forget that, like I said, we're all novices in different areas and we overestimate how much it's the same people asking for our help. I think the more we can back up and realize we're all beginners in different areas, that's a better place to start.
I have a question here. What have you done when you ask for compassion for people and the manager replies that the rule can't be changed?
That is difficult. I would say in the situation like with the library cards, I felt strongly enough that this was not fair, that when the manager did not seem to want to hear what I had to say, I did report it to higher level administration. And it took some time, but eventually they made clear that this was not an appropriate way to serve our community. But I think, I mean, there's definitely an element of choosing your battles in all of this.
I have anyone who wants to add another comment, you're welcome. I'm not sure, did I read this out before? Forgive me if I have. We have Megan saying, we quit charging fines, but still charge for replacements if it never comes back. People seem way more likely to return things, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. And my library as well, my current library ended fines last summer, and as well, we still charge for replacements. That seems like a very reasonable line to hold, because we are still part of the sharing economy. Ultimately, we really want those books back so someone else can borrow them.
I have Shannon say, sometimes it's difficult to remember we serve people, not the institutions. There are good arguments on both sides.
I think that fits well with the book as well. That it's to embrace the complexity, not oversimplify any of these situations.
All right. Okay, and we have another person saying, there is some discomfort in getting close to patrons, though. If they are on the other side, or if they are on the older side and need assistance with technology changes, but they use pet names for staff as a normal part of their speech. What advice do you have for balancing those two needs and staying compassionate to their needs and your own?
Well, I mean, I think if we take the time to have a conversation with people and let them know that we want to do whatever we can to help them, but this way that they're talking to us, you know, really isn't respectful. We appreciate that they not use pet names. I think most people are pretty responsive to that. I mean, it could be that it's something they don't fully realize that they're doing. You know, we're all kind of in a generation of one. We have our own unique life experience and sometimes don't realize how society is changing around us. That would be my advice, to just not jump into it immediately, but have a conversation with them, talk through what your concerns are.
I think we have one more question. It's kind of in vein of some others that we've had. And it asks, how do you handle situations where you're asked to employ practical wisdom, but then upper management tells you your decision is wrong?
It's difficult, because I think it's never a good idea to kind of randomly disregard what your management is telling you to do. I think if you can have those conversations with them when you're not directly working with the public, that's the best way to approach this, and realize it may take time to, to come to an agreeable solution. And I recommend reading the book.
Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you. I'm going to take one more comment here. As a director 12 years ago, I went fine-free and cut out many library sacred cows. Many of the staff revolted and quit over time. It took 10 years to change the culture within the organization. And the advice here is stick it out. That's what this person said.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really enjoyed the discussion. And thank you so much. I hope you join us again for our conference series. I think then we can end the recording as we say goodbye.